Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Jim Fogg, Interim Executive Director of the Santa Fe Council on International Relations, and we have a very interesting program. I think that's all I have to say before I bring on my colleague here in Santa Fe, Pat Kuchlis, who's going to introduce Ambassador Ron Newman. Pat?
Thank you, Jim. On behalf of the Santa Fe World Affairs Forum, I would like to thank Jim, who's, as he told you, interim CIR Executive Director, and the CIR Board for making it possible to share this web conversation with Ambassador Ronald Newman with the Santa Fe World Affairs Forum members. We appreciate it. We hope that it will be a part of a cooperative relationship for those of us concerned about the fraught state of the world and America's role in it. And we will be announcing our number of our own programs as we come along during the year. Ambassador Newman is a distinguished American career diplomat with lengthy service in the Middle East and South Asia, including as ambassador to Afghanistan from 2005 to 7. In this program today, he will discuss his views on what needs to change to revitalize the State Department and U.S. diplomacy 20 years after 9/11. So please welcome the ambassador. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Pat. Welcome, Ambassador.
Thank you very much.
Before we get started on some of the important issues that Pat mentioned, I want to have a little bit of fun. We've seen all these pictures and video and everything that's happening about Afghanistan, and it's been so dire. Take us back. I'll let you say how many years when your dad was ambassador. And I read that you had a lot of fun going around Afghanistan as a college student, I think.
Yeah, Jim, I certainly did. Just after college, I had the 3.5 month gap after graduate school before I had to show up for the U.S. Army. And my wife and I both went to Afghanistan. And we traveled, we were old enough to travel on our own and unemployed enough to be free to do so. So we traveled a good deal. We were down in Kandahar, hunted gazelle outside Lashkar, where there are all kinds of battles that have just recently gone on. Drove all the way through the center of Afghanistan with one U.S. aide, geological expert, and his Afghan counterpart. And I even went up on with a hunting party, although I wasn't a hunter, into the what they call the Wakhan corridor, this corridor that goes that little panhandle out to the east, where we went to the end of the road by jeep and then by horse along the Oxus, Amudara, and then by yak up into the Pamirs base camp, about 13,000 feet. So I saw a lot of Afghanistan that younger Afghans have never seen because of years and years of warfare. And they got a kick out of the fact that I'd seen the country and the state that they wish it could return to.
So what was the atmosphere like in the capital, in Kabul at that time? Because I've seen pictures where you see women dressed in Western dress, and there were lots of restaurants. Looked like quite a fun place to be.
Well, it was a mix. I mean, of course, it was much smaller. It's, I don't know, 3 million or so now. It was about maybe 800,000 then.
I'm going to put you on the spot. When was this?
No, 1967.
Okay.
So you could tell where I was going when I went to the Army. It was a mix. You could see a woman fully covered in a burqa walking down the street holding hands with somebody in a Western skirt. And it was basically okay. I mean, it was still Kabul was more cosmopolitan than the rest of the country. And that was certainly true, but it was a mix. You had girls in school and you had women in offices. And when you look at pictures of that time or when we were there, women were dressed about as they were in the probably 50s in the United States.
Let me remind all of our viewers as well that we'd love for you to ask questions and just type them in the Q&A box, not in the chat box, please, in the Q&A, and we'll weave as many of those in the conversation as we can. What were the relations like between Afghanistan and the United States at that time?
They were good. Remember, Afghanistan really began development only in the late 1950s. The Soviets were very active there. We were a second string player because the Soviets were much closer, as well as putting a lot of money in. And so we tried to balance what they did to try to give the Afghan government, the royal government in those days, the king, room to not be too closely tied to the Soviets. And we even did some coordination to try to avoid duplication of their of projects. So we built roads that tended to run east-west. They built roads that went north-south and then invaded over them later. Um, and we had big agricultural efforts, big aid project in the Helmand Valley, big dam. So a little bit of military training, not much military sales. The Russians dominated that, but an active aid program.
So I wish we could be talking about how Afghanistan was, but we probably ought to spend some time on the current events. And in July, you had just come back from a trip to Afghanistan, and you had a piece published in the Washington Post, and the headline was Afghan resistance to the Taliban needs US support and a big moral boost. And I guess we could say that didn't happen. Why did you write that piece at that time?
Well, remember what this time was. I went to Afghanistan early July, which is, in retrospect, about 6 weeks before the collapse. Yeah, I went because I have been going back to Afghanistan regularly since my retirement, and I hadn't been for a couple of years because of COVID, one thing and another. And I felt that if I was going to continue to talk about the subject, I needed to bring myself up to date. And when I went, it was obvious that the situation was quite dire. And part of the reason was, of course, poor performance, of the Afghan government and other things. But I felt that a great deal of the problem was an uncertainty about the United States. Because remember, when President Biden announced his decision for withdrawal, that was not the only policy. There was another piece of the policy, which was that we would continue to support the Afghan forces. And that was what Afghans were in doubt about. And there were a lot of reasons for that, some of them going back, frankly, into the Trump administration. This has been growing for a long time. But the fact that President Biden made his announcement with absolutely no planning for how he was going to carry out the second half of that policy meant that we were somewhat incoherent. It wasn't just that we pulled out 3,500 approximately troops. We pulled out 15,000 contractors that were essential for the operation of the Afghan Air Force, the supply system, all kinds of things. And when we made that decision to pull them out, we had no plan in place on how to get that work done. And, you don't make up a plan to replace 15,000 people overnight. So the Afghans were hearing that we would be supportive, but they weren't seeing it in action. And they'd already had a number of reasons under the Trump administration to doubt that our words and our actions matched up. And I felt that the morale problem was the root of a lot of the failure to perform. Also, there were things that the Afghans could do. There were some positive things. There was a popular resistance springing up in a lot of places. It needed support basically from the Afghan government, but from us as well. And so I felt that these actions might stave off the defeat if we took them, which we didn't. So I'll never know whether I was right or wrong. The other thing was that I wanted to remind people that Afghan history has had a number of what they call tipping points. Afghan wars have generally not ended with a climactic battle. They've ended when one side decides our prospects are basically hopeless and we're going to quit. And there are a lot of reasons for that. I remember, give you an anecdote, being down in Helmand about 2012, doing a survey of local police for General Miller on a previous tour of his. And I was talking to an old police commander out around the Helmand Dam. And I asked him, what are you going to do if this program doesn't work? And he said, well, I'll have to surrender. Because he said, you have to understand, if I just put my weapon down and go home, they'll hunt me down. We've killed each other. We have blood debts. But if I surrender when I'm armed, my men are with me, we surrender. That's an honorable action. They'll leave me alone. That's a context in which you don't, you might fight to the death as long as you think there is a reason to do so, but you don't fight when it's hopeless. And what we were taking away was hope. So I reminded people in that article, as you saw, that if the cities started to fall, everything could unravel very quickly. And, I didn't predict that it would be 3 weeks, 2 days, and 24 minutes or something, but I said that if the cities start to fall, this could unravel very quickly and that we could have a very messy evacuation. Um, and I'm sorry that that was pretty much on target.
Well, your last sentence was the window for action is closing rapidly. We need to move now. And you certainly forecast that correctly.
Yeah, sorry about that.
So when you look at it now in hindsight, was it a moral failure on our part? And what can we learn from it?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'm going to give you a little extensive answer to that one. Because I think there's one thing not to do, there's something important to do. The thing not to do is to make this a partisan question. There is enough blame in every one of the four administrations, including the one I worked for with. It should not be a partisan issue. And the second is that what we need to do is a really extensive deep dive lessons learned effort. Now, we don't do this very often. General Zinni said to me once that he'd seen many lessons observed and very few learned. And I suspect we're going to do that again. What we're doing right now in innumerable editorials of the chattering class is to reduce 20 years of effort to a few bumper sticker phrases. They wouldn't fight, don't do nation building, don't do democracy. First of all, these things they're not so much wholly wrong as they are gross oversimplifications. And if that's what you reduce your knowledge to, you're not going to learn anything useful. I'll give you two quick examples. There is a lot you could take away from our efforts at democracy building in Iraq and Afghanistan. By the way, I served in Iraq as well as Afghanistan. And we're going to be involved in democracy work. Biden administration is a big proponent of that. But we may not be doing a whole nation building, but we're going to be involved in democracy. So we have some real lessons to learn, some of which are not going to be automatic. One of my takeaways, for instance, is trying to build democracy, having early elections at a national level is a huge error. Well, we've done that over and over again. So if you're going to get into that as a potential lesson, there's a lot to be discussed. Why did we do this? Is it the way we have to do things? What are your alternatives? Same thing, everybody has been saying over and over again, and it's not a new thing. We had in Vietnam, you built the army in your own image. Correct. But if you don't want to build the army in your own image, what image do you want? You can't take several thousand military and say, go train a foreign army and just make it up. Each one of you make it up the way you want to do it yourself. That's not going to work. So that requires a sustained effort. And we need to do that. The starting point is the Congress needs to reauthorize the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan for at least a couple more years to work on this. And we need to resolve to actually work on it, not just to put it in the rearview mirror, which is what we tend to do. I'll quit there before I gush on.
But is it not a slippery slope? Because I've heard others, such as Ambassador Crocker, who was with us a few weeks ago, say that we really needed to stand up the Afghan military forces so that terrorists would not come back into the country, and that they needed to build a certain infrastructure. But why I use the word slippery slope, didn't that go to nation building all over the country? And look, I'm certainly for providing opportunities for girls and women, but that became such a major part of our work in reforming the banking system, et cetera, et cetera. So Do we just try to do too much without adequate preparation, or maybe we shouldn't even be doing that?
You could make arguments for all of those things. None of them are simple. Um, part of the problem is once we were in, remember, we hadn't planned to fight a war in Afghanistan. You don't do a lot of advanced planning to go to a place you never planned to go. Um, then the question is, how do you get out? Now, I suppose in retrospect, one could have said to this miserable place that had totally destroyed infrastructure and, uh, you know, women huddling and warlords and human rights abuses, uh, that's fine. That's just going to have to continue. We've done what we came to do, knocked off most of Al Qaeda, even if we couldn't find bin Laden. So it's just going to have to go back to repression. I don't know how well that would have gone down with the American people after you had pictures, okay, Taliban are gone now, but if they come back, they can go back to executing women in the Stock Stadium at midterm, at halftime, which is what they did. Um, well, if you don't want to do that, then you have to put in place something with some potential for stability. And otherwise, there's no nice choice in between. One of the problems with a place like Afghanistan is you don't get good choices. You only get hard ones. So uh, if you want to do something halfway stable, then the idea was, well, we'll have an election, we'll get a government, and initially we'll build a very small army. Initially we were only going to build a kind of internal constabulary. Um, well, my military colleagues tend to say the enemy gets a vote. Taliban started coming back. By 2005, when I got there, I was reporting that the war was going to get a whole lot worse in 2006. But you couldn't get any real resources because everything was going to Iraq. So yes, you have a kind of slippery slope, but how do you not step on it? And then as the war gets worse, if you don't want to fight it yourself and you don't want automatically to lose, you have to build a force you can turn the war over to. But armies don't exist sort of free floating. They're come out of a country, society. So if you're going to have an army, Obama had this problem. We're not going to do nation building. That was an explicit part of the Obama policy. But we're going to have this massive increase in the army, by the way, with completely unrealistic timelines. But if you're going to have an army, you're going to have a state that supports it. You're going to have a government. And the government's part of a state, and the state has to somehow survive. So you need an economy. And damn, you've tied yourself in sort of a verbal pretzel that you're not going to do nation building, but in fact, you're doing it while trying to deny that you're doing it. And that was the path the Obama administration went down. If you look at the budgets of the Obama administration, while they're saying we're not going to do nation building, they're in it hip deep. And it's frankly the only explanation for the budgets.
So one of the things that I always try to remember is that when we left with our 25 or 3,000 troops and all the other contractors, that really left it so that all the other countries who were part of the loose coalition left as well. And we need to remember
Well,
that.
it was
Correct?
part of the NATO coalition. It wasn't a loose coalition. Iraq was a loose coalition of the willing. Afghanistan was NATO's only real war, okay, which NATO nations followed us into in gesture largely of solidarity with the United States. And we then ignored their advice and forced them out because once we left, they couldn't stay. And it's one of these interesting things. Biden administration came in saying a lot of good things, to my mind, about consultation with allies. We're going to be different from that damn Trump administration. We're going to go talk to our friends. Well, they went off and talked to all their NATO friends, and then they ignored them. And so you got Trump with a smiley face. No real difference in the amount of attention paid to allies. And then we did it again in August when the question arose, should we hold to the August 31 deadline for ending the evacuation, leaving behind some of our nationals, a lot of people who fought with us, certain number of allied nationals, allied nations, NATO nations, British who had forces on the ground with us in Kabul at the airport. Uh, Others said, please extend it. We said no. So from a standpoint of allies, now you're wondering, well, is this administration really different from the Trump one in terms of its fundamental orientation? You know, or is this the new United States that talks a better game, but actually just deals where it wants to go and
So,
ignores
so you
partners?
tell me, Ambassador Newman, what is it?
Oh, I don't think we know yet. Um, and I don't think we can evaluate it in a way. It'll be different for some issues and for others. And in any event, you know, people will still play with us because we're too big to ignore. The trouble is they do so now wondering if we're too unreliable to trust.
You know, that leads me to a question I wanted to bring up. The Economist, and this had one of the stories by Lexington last week was the Biden doctrine has yet to emerge. Beware those who claim otherwise. And there was a wonderful quote. Let me see if I can put my hands on it. Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs, Andrei Gromyko, many years ago, he said the United States has many doctrines and concepts proclaimed at different times that the United States is unable to pursue a solid, coherent, and consistent policy. You've worked for a number of administrations, a number of secretaries of state. Is the word doctrine a word that we should even consider?
In the military, yes, but politically, well, I mean, there are certain theological, if you will, or notional underpinnings to policy. I mean, there's certain elements like tension between the promotion of democracy and virtue in various ways and realpolitik. Those tensions have been there since the beginning of the republic. When President John Adams talked about we'll defend our point of view, but we go not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. He was talking about this same basic tension that pulls back and forth. Kissinger moves more toward realpolitik. Jimmy Carter sets up a human rights bureau. So that vacillation is a problem in United States policy. Um, we have a fairly short time frame. And we have a very open, brawling political system, as I don't have to explain to anybody who looks at Washington. My father used to call it Disneyland on the Potomac, and it was reasonably civilized then. Uh, so it's very difficult to have a coherent policy. It works when you have a really strong president, secretary of state who have very firm ideas about where they want to go. To some extent, Reagan did. Um, didn't pay much attention to detail, but he had a very strong policy view. Certainly, the first President Bush with Jim Baker had very strong views, but we have had, we've only had, by my count, three presidents, not counting whether or not Biden will qualify, but three presidents since World War II that have come to office with a strong background in foreign policy and actually operating in a foreign policy environment. Eisenhower, Nixon, the first Bush. No other president has come with that background. We do foreign policy as on-the-job training for presidents. That being the case, you probably shouldn't expect them to come with too many very fixed ideas. But we elect some pretty smart people mostly, and so you get adjustment. You saw that in the Clinton administration. But when you have people new to the area, the area of foreign policy writ large, not steeped in it, despite whatever they may have said in sort of general theoretical sense, you're not going to get a lot of consistency in practice. Although I think having said that, you actually have a great deal of consistency in American foreign policy writ large. If you go up to the 30 or 50,000 foot level instead of looking at how we handle individual problems, the policy of containment, the opposition of the Soviet Union, general evolution of policy toward arms control, those things were fairly consistent over quite a while. But when you get outside that realm of containment, where we had a kind of organizing principle, even if perhaps simplistic, then it kind of breaks down at the edges.
Well, I want to be sure that we talk about your article and more about the Department of State, but one more question on Afghanistan, and this is from one of our viewers, William Pollock. Steve Cole, the journalist and author, has reported that the U.S. could never get its arms around the Afghan reality, that the country may never be able to be a nation as we use the term. It's a territory of family and tribal rule. What, in your view, would Afghanistan need to do in order to become really a nation? And I would assume right now with the Taliban in control, we really or don't know.
Um, no, now we've got a lot of questions. I know Steve and I have a lot of regard for him. I'm not sure I completely agree with that. Um, it kind of depends on how you're looking at Afghanistan. When when you look at it internally from the various factions that fuss with each other, a lot of fussing. On the other hand, when you look from outside, they tend to pull together. In the 25 years of war before we came in against the Soviets, and then the war of the Mujahideen, no Afghan faction fought to create a separate country. Nobody fought to separate. They shed a lot of blood to rule in Kabul. Um, there are some different conceptions of the state, of what the state's responsible for as well. But if you look at, say, Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, look at Bosnia, look at some of the other failed states, Yemen right now, where you have a strong secessionist movement in the south. Afghanistan, for all the blood it's churned up, has never had a secessionist movement. So you've got to take that into account when you say there's no country. What there is not is a lot of agreement on how to rule, other than the monarchy or a single person, or how to divide up the power once you've had years of destruction and power has devolved to a bunch of commanders with guns who, frankly, were not, in a traditional sense, tribal leaders. Largely, they displaced tribal leaders. The trouble with Afghanistan is, people want and deserve some nice, simple answers, and you almost never get them with Afghanistan.
So let's do turn to your article. Several, I guess it was at least two or three of our members sent me a copy of your article that was in the Foreign Service Journal,
Mhm.
and it has a great title. Let me pull it: Intervention, Unlearn Lessons or Gripes of a Professional. So I'll just turn it over to you to talk about, where are some of the issues that are really facing our Department of State. Uh, you and I both know Mark Grossman, who worked on a report with Ambassador Nick Burns at the Belfer Center in Harvard. Richard Haas at the Council on Foreign Relations did a report. In a sense, your article is the third report that I've read. So take it away.
Well, mine is a piece of that, and it's more narrowly focused at this business of intervention, which, now we're not going to do for a while because we've been pretty burned. But the chances, based on history, are that we will do some parts of this again. And so that article complained that there were certain pieces of this that we had not learned. State Department's never been able to respond adequately to requests to step up its game in these kind of places. And I noted that the first request by the military for State Department help to come govern the country was 1848 in Mexico, and we couldn't do it then. So we've got a long tradition of not quite making this, and we don't study it. Um, uh, there's a couple of things that are part of this issue of intervention, but that may be a broader issue. And one I talked about is this arrogance of American policymaking, that we think that you can make policy by Americans talking to Americans without bringing in foreigners. And that often doesn't work very well, but between the way we think about it and the way we argue about it in Congress and among our centers of power, we've often used up most of our flexibility with each other before we actually get to negotiate with foreigners. Uh, but those are particular issues. I think the State Department now has several problems. Some of us are of their own making. The State Department is not a lean and flexible instrument of policy, and it needs a lot of delayering. Those are issues that have been touched on by many. It needs a solid basis of professional education and training, which it does not do because the Congress won't pay for it. And if you're going to have, anything equivalent to military, Colin Powell came in, for just give you an anecdote, pretty well known, and he'd spent about 20% of his career in the military in one kind of professional education or training or another. And he asked Mark Grossman, how long have you spent? And Mark said, well, except for language training, 2 weeks. So it's a long apprenticeship. You learn by doing, but there's room for professional education. And to do that, you have to have more personnel. Military is able to do professional education at length because they have a kind of a surplus afloat over their unit strength so that there are people available to go to school. State Department doesn't do that. Military does replacements in place. In wars, we do gaps.
Let me interject and ask you this. Do other countries do a better job?
Absolutely. We've done several studies of that at the Academy. There's a study that was done at the University of Texas at Austin in conjunction with AFSA. Other major countries, every single one of them, whether it's Britain or Brazil or China or Russia, does far more to train its diplomats and educate them and train them professionally than we do.
Well, you give that anecdote with Mark Grossman and Secretary Powell. That had to be 20 years ago. Why is the Foreign Service unable to convince, I guess the answer is Congress, why are they unable to make a persuasive argument?
That's a good question. Why does Congress not assume that we need a professional foreign service? I don't know.
Maybe because we're not building widgets in 50 states.
Maybe. It's not a big constituency. And, you've got years and years of budget problems, and we've cut the budget. And then the budget got absorbed in wars, too. And in fact, Colin Powell did work very hard and build a part of a float, and then that got sucked up in Iraq and Afghanistan. You've had individual congressmen who have sponsored provisions to try to do something about this, but generally they don't make it to a vote. There's a certain amount of it is inertia rather than opposition.
I've always thought, sir, that one of the things is, if you look across the country, there's 40, 50,000 members of World Affairs Councils. And it would seem that this organization could be a stronger advocacy if there was a way to do it without hurting the 501c3 status of all these organizations. But I know
one can educate. I mean, it's only lobbying if you're pushing people to. I've studied this rather closely because I run a 501c3. It's only lobbying if you're pushing people to vote for a specific bill. If you're pushing, our mantra is we don't do lobbying, but we do heavy education.
So hear that, members who are either on today or listening to our program on YouTube. You also talk about something, and that is tour links, and especially in Afghanistan and Iraq. You mentioned how, and I love this, you said an institutional frontal lobotomy that was repeated yearly. That'll have to go down in history as a great description.
Well, we've had this problem a long time. Younger members probably wouldn't remember the name John Paul Vann, but he was a person to pay attention to in Vietnam for many years. And he's the one who actually coined this phrase that we haven't had 12 years experience. We've had 1 year, 12 times. And we've been doing it ever since. There's an interesting book by a Georgetown professor, Lise Howard, about a comparative book on what has worked in various UN missions. And one of the things she raises is a learning culture, that the organization learns how to deal in the country and it improves its game as it stays. You cannot build a learning organization on 1 year tours. It just won't work. But, we've got a lot of pressures. People want family lives. Um, there are a lot of reasons that people don't want to just go off to wars or hardship posts and stay there a long time. So it's going to take a lot of thinking through. We haven't really addressed it. Um, we've treated it as it just has to be that way, and maybe it does for a variety of personnel reasons, but the nation pays a price for it.
Let me again encourage our viewers and listeners to submit questions and we'll work them into the conversation. When I look at resumes of foreign diplomats, there seems to be a lot more specialization, say in North America or the Middle East. Where do you stand on that? Because when you look at a typical resume of a U.S. Foreign Service officer, they've served in several continents. Do we make a mistake with that?
Uh, Possibly. Now, it depends a bit on the function. There's certain business, if you're a consular officer or if you're a management officer, there's a lot enough similarity in the job. You can probably do it in a variety of places without deep cultural knowledge. You can't be ignorant, but you got to know more. If you're going to be a political officer, or to some extent an economic officer, certainly if you're going to deal with the press and culture as a public affairs officer, then you're going to have to know more about the country. Now, I used to joke that my whole career shows up on a fairly small map. Um, so I guess I'm part of the older generation, but it's true we don't do that as much as we used to. And you can over specialize, but I think it's a mistake not to realize that it takes time to build a deeper understanding of how cultures function and how people function in them. And the reason for that is not just to be smart about foreigners, it's so that you can figure out how to sell your policies. So, after all, the fundamental job of a diplomat is to get foreigners to do what we want and to do it in a way that they like it enough that we can come back and get them to do something else. It's not just to make nice or something. So you're acquiring this cultural knowledge so that you can tell your government, whether they choose to listen or not, uh, what might work in a policy, why something won't work, or if you have a policy, how you might tailor it, market it, in short, in order to make it as acceptable as possible. If you don't have that, then you proceed on the somewhat arrogant basis that because you understand it, they'll understand it too.
And you're building personal relationships longer
They're
that you
key.
work in the region.
They're absolutely essential.
So let's be sure that we have time to talk about the American Academy of Diplomacy. And I want to hear about the museum. I haven't traveled to Washington for the longest period, I think, in my life now, but last time I was there, I saw the beginning of the shell of the museum. So tell us about both.
Well, I'm not directly involved in the museum, but I certainly follow it. That is to be the only a diplomacy museum, of which there are none in the world. And part of it will be inside the department. It has built part of it. It has more to do. There are some exhibits. There's a lot more that they've acquired the exhibits, but haven't acquired the space yet inside the department. The Academy is a kind of funny organization. It's now um, 37 years old. It was formed in 1983. It is it is deliberately small. We're only 360 members now. Members have to be nominated by other members and elected. We never elect everybody on the ballot just to keep it somewhat selective.
Like the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, I would like to say that we are elite in terms of the background of performance of people, not elitist as a nose in the air kind of attitude. Uh, the Academy has evolved over time. Its current mission is really twofold. One is to talk to Americans about what diplomacy is, why it's important. A lot of people will tell you that they believe diplomacy is important, but then they have a little trouble explaining why or exactly what that means. So that's part of the mission. The other half of the mission is to talk to the US government, State Department in particular, about how it could do things better, talk to Congress. Um, and that's where we're different from a think tank, which, if it studies something, the project's done when they publish the report. We then go to work pestering the department, lobbying Congress, frankly. We got some changes made in how state and commerce are supposed to work together to sell America overseas, business, commercial diplomacy. We think that diplomats don't get out of their fortress embassies enough, and that we're losing this critical contact with foreigners. So our big project right now is a project to work on that, partly cultural, partly tactics, training the department. But a foundational element is to change this thing called the Accountability Review Board. And you saw that in action at the time of Benghazi.
Absolutely.
It has become politicized in a way that people, it wasn't actually the intent of the law, but it has evolved into a place where people feel that if something happens, they're going to look for who's accountable, who screwed up, even if nobody screwed up. Sometimes bad things happen, but it doesn't mean somebody screwed up. Um, and that in itself has become a huge pressure for people not to take any risks. And so we think that law needs to be changed. So we did a report and we suggested changes, but then we've gone to work talking to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and trying to get them to draft legislation. And we're getting some progress. So that's the kind of thing we're doing as well.
Are all your members retired diplomats, U.S. diplomats, or do you have people from academia,
Uh,
or the
they
military?
they are all people who have practiced foreign policy, foreign affairs as practitioners, not theoreticians. However, they're not all career foreign service officers. We have a number of former directors of AID. We have a few military, Admiral Stavridis, former NATO commanders, remember. We have a few members with an intelligence background. So we have a mix, but the common, we have a number who are political or non-career appointees, but they had multiple positions, and they've proved themselves as practitioners.
How are you funded, and how can the average, or say one of our members, what benefits do you offer them? I know I enjoy your podcast that you support, the ambassador and the general.
Yeah. We have two podcasts, and we have that one called American Diplomat, that's a little lighter in tone. We are entirely privately funded. There is no government money, and I have to go raise money. But it's a very small organization, so we do a number of programs that people are interested in. We have a very active website. We One of the things we do, by the way, for people who are interested in teaching in the field of diplomacy, is that we regularly cull and put online the syllabi of all our members who are teaching at the university level, and it's indexed so that people who are going into teaching, who want to see what other people are doing, can find relevant course programs, look them up. We have, as you say, these two podcasts, the American Diplomat and the General and the Ambassador.
Which is great fun. I really enjoy that.
I'm delighted to know you listen to it.
So, how does your organization collaborate with the USGLC, the United States Global Leadership Coalition?
We try to work with them as much as they want to work with us. They don't always. But we admire them. Now they're a different kind of organization because they are a dedicated lobby group. So we don't work directly on the lobbying because we're a 501c3 and they're a 4, but we cooperate in a number of their programs, and we're open to cooperating more when they want diplomats on the stage as well as generals.
So, we have about 10 minutes left, and I have to ask you, is what happened with France just a major screw up, miscommunication, or are we not getting all of the story?
Well, remember, I'm out of government, so I can't tell you if there's a big
I know,
piece.
but I gotta believe that you and others are talking about this.
Oh, we're talking about it a lot. because what's bothersome is there's a certain similarity between Afghanistan and this Australian mix-up. Announce a policy and don't know, haven't thought through how you're going to do it, haven't done the damage control. Uh, that's really unexpected. I mean, these are some smart people in the Biden administration. They're people with a lot of background, and they're acting like they couldn't run a two-car funeral. And I don't know why. The hope is that being smart people, they will step back and say, well, wait a minute, what are we, instead of just going into damage control and circle the wagons, that at least internally, they will look at each other and say, wait a minute, had we let this, how did we let France be surprised? Because there's no good reason for that.
I,
I think there's some stories they weren't as surprised as they say. They knew something was out there, but they didn't get told.
are they
Uh,
making a bigger deal of this because of the upcoming presidential elections?
oh, there are multiple reasons. I mean, I don't claim to be inside President Macron's head, but um, he's 6 months away from a election. He's got Marie Le Pen and the nationalists to contend with. He's just been dissed by his major ally and lost a deal worth about $60 billion with the impact of that on French trade. So yeah, you can understand where he'd be a little miffed.
So I was listening to Morning Joe this morning, and Joe said this was a major mess. We need to tell friends that we'll make it up to them. We need to spend dollars, which seemed to me a little odd, but what is there something we should and can do right now?
Um, if there's certainly things we should do, whether we can do them, I don't know. I mean, this is tricky. It probably was never going to be possible for Australia to have two different submarine fleets of different technologies. So I don't know that there's a way to compromise on the deal, but I don't, there may be other things, there may be other deals. At this point, I don't know what's possible out there. I hope there's a very active search for what we might do, but I don't know.
So you've worked with a number of secretaries of state, and you know, I only get to read biographies. Who do you think was the most effective Secretary of State, and who did you enjoy working with the most?
Well, remember, when you're a fairly junior officer, you're working under a Secretary of State, but you're pretty far down under him. So I don't want to exaggerate how closely I've known these people. Uh, Certainly, the the two that really stand out as effective in terms of delivery are George Shultz and Jim Baker. Henry Kissinger, obviously, in a different sense. Kissinger had an incredible ability to put conceptualization and implementation together. Baker's a deal maker par excellence, but with a magnificent ability to know exactly what the president wanted. There's a great book on Baker called The Man Who Ran Washington.
Oh yeah, Peter Baker's book and Susan's
Yeah,
fantastic.
fantastic book. In some ways, I would say George Shultz, who cared more about the Foreign Service and the instruments of diplomacy, maybe because he'd been a Marine and had that background. There are very few secretaries who have actually worked for resources for the Foreign Service. Schultz is still remembered warmly in the diplomatic profession for a number of reasons. For one thing, when there was a movement to have lie detector tests, Schultz said no, threatened to resign rather than have his people be given a test. That was a unique demonstration of support for his institution. Also, we have now a marvelous campus for diplomatic education at the Foreign Service Institute, and that was a vision of George Shultz's that wouldn't have been brought through without him. So really, there are only a few secretaries that have fought for resources for the institution. Schultz is one, Colin Powell is another, and Hillary Clinton is a third who fought for the budget. So different people, different aspects of judgment, but certainly as secretaries of state who made a real difference in policy. The three that would stand out would be Kissinger, Baker, and Schultz.
And I won't ask you to elaborate, Ambassador, but who is the worst? And I'm afraid it might be one from my good state, former state of Texas.
Well, there's a lot of competition um, for that. Um, well, actually, if you said who did the most damage to Foreign Service, it would be Tillerson, much more so than Pompeo. Um, yeah, that's a long story, but
I was afraid you were going to say that. He was much better at running an oil company. Pat, I know you have a comment or question. Come on.
Okay, one short comment and then a question. Um, as a former press and cultural officer, I would just say one of the things that we had that was our tours in country tended to be longer. Mm-hmm. We always had the language training, and I think that made a difference in comparison with our State Department colleagues.
Agree.
And that's my comment. And then my question to you is regarding a comment you made earlier about fortress embassies. And they're not I really have problems with them. But my question is, what do you think would help in terms of getting American diplomats out of those fortresses and talking to people? And would it mean getting rid of some of these behemoths?
And the one thing I would add to that, if I may, is, as you said, Ambassador, if anything goes wrong, now it is a major political partisan story.
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of pieces that have to come together. We may need some cultural change since people have gotten used to operating one way over a decade. We need to up our game in terms of tactics and training. It doesn't mean we should become, clandestine. We're not the CIA, but we need to find reasonably secure ways to go outside the embassy that aren't the full up to armored car convoy. And that is very different from country to country and what the conditions of security are. I mean, the kind of things that I did, getting out to talk to people in Iraq, in Algeria, where there was a war going on with a blanket death threat to all foreigners, and the kind of things I did in Afghanistan were somewhat different, but based on the differences in threats. But then I think a fundamental thing is leadership at the top. At the end of the day, the Secretary of State has to be willing to stand up for people, even if somebody gets hurt or killed. Now, they don't stand up for people if they've done something, incredibly stupid or criminal, but, just as in the military, you have an element of risk in the Foreign Service. That's, you've been there, and there's 250 names on the walls in the State Department of people who've died in the line of duty. The old days, they were yellow fever and drowning at sea, and now they're getting killed in ambushes. And that comes with turf. So you don't want to be stupid. You don't want to take unnecessary risk, but you have to be willing to run some risks. And if something happens and people have done, what they should have done, given the knowledge they had, you shouldn't be throwing them to the dogs. The Secretary of State has got to stand up and say, I'm really sorry this happened, but these people were doing their job. They were doing the business of the nation. They were taking the precautions that we knew how to take. And sometimes this happens. And if Secretary of State won't do that, you're not going to find a lot of people taking risk underneath.
Let me remind our listeners and viewers that there's a book that came out, I guess, about 18 months ago called The Ambassadors. And he focused on Robert Ford, Ryan Crocker, Ann Patterson, and sadly, Chris Stevens. But it focused on expeditionary diplomats. And it was a very, very good book. And I urge everyone to read it. Pat, thank you for bringing on your members. And And Ambassador Newman, what a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much.
Well, great. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk about some of these issues for the department and how the nation's diplomats need to do the nation's business.
Well, we look forward to continuing to follow the work of the American Academy of Diplomacy. And really, folks, subscribe to the podcast. It's really well worth it. It's the Ambassador and the General. Have a great
General
evening.
Ambassador, yeah. You can find it on our website. Just Google American Academy of Diplomacy, and you'll find both podcasts on the website.
Fantastic. Thanks again, everybody. We'll see you again very soon back here at the Council on
Thanks a
International
lot.
Relations. Bye.
Thank you.